Australia has fallen. On Sunday, 22nd of May 2022, the Australian Labor Party swept an historic victory in the federal election to unseat the incumbent Conservative Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Yet when I say Australia has fallen, I'm not referring to this most recent political upheaval. No, Australia fell 2 years ago. What this Labour victory signifies is but a further backward slide into the authoritarian arms of the globalist technocrats at the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, which was already well entrenched in Australia's system of government on Morrison's watch. What the bulk of the voting public down under has yet to realise is that the two-party system of the democratic West is a sham. The good people of the United States, in keeping with their restless revolutionary past, are beginning to understand this as their country bears the brunt of the globalist assault on liberty, and may yet rise to the occasion and reclaim their birthright through populist reformation of the Republican Party, which in its current form functions only as a handbrake for the Davos agenda-driven corporate establishment and their puppets in the Democratic Party. But the rest of the Western world is still largely oblivious. The people of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK and Western Europe have not yet begun to properly understand that the choice between red and blue every 3 years is in fact no choice at all, and that they are ruled by a one-party system, which simply has two slightly divergent factions within it. One which pushes relentlessly ahead with the supranational agenda of the WEF and UN, and a more conservative one, which merely slows down the inevitable surrender of national sovereignty. This is why we continue to see bland establishment bobbleheads like Boris Johnson and Scott Morrison elected to lead so-called conservative governments, and who then proceed to sit idly by and facilitate radical socialist globalist change within their countries with no popular mandate. Politicians like this serve merely to gatekeep and to quell the outrage of their voting base with endless, meaningless platitudes. Meanwhile, neo-Marxist firebrands like Justin Trudeau and Jacinda Ardern staff the left-wing factions of the global uniparty in places like Canada and New Zealand, accelerating the change and providing their sponsors in Davos with useful beta testing data as their guinea pig populations are subjected to authoritarian social experiments such as we saw throughout 2020 and 2021. Politicians like Trudeau and Ardern are the vanguard of the WEF, literally card-carrying members with alumni credentials for their Young Global Leaders Forum, the vehicle used to penetrate the cabinets of world governments, as Klaus Schwab explains in the interview that I've linked in the description, where he also boasts that more than half of Justin Trudeau's cabinet are young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. We will see more celebrity-style leaders like Ardern and Trudeau emerging in the coming years. They are youthful, glib, and relatively attractive. Their rhetoric is riddled with spellbinding PR speak, and they give the impression of being well suited not just to television, but to entertainment at large, playing their roles of compassionate and personable leaders so well that they could indeed be starring in their own movies. But Australia's new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, is a more traditional character. Indeed, this old-school type of politician is typical of Australia, a plain-spoken bloke who runs a conventional campaign and has middle-of-the-road positions on issues. Because that's how Australians are on the whole, a mild-mannered and easy-going people, naive in some respects, still seeing the world through the simplistic neoliberal lens of 20 years ago. In many respects, Australia is indeed a conservative country, not nearly as far along the radical left-wing path as their cousins across the Tasman Sea in New Zealand, and more akin to the United States in what remains, even in the face of constant destabilisation efforts, a strong sense of patriotism and national identity. But this does not mean Australia is immune to the creeping internationalist malaise of wokeism and the demoralisation and abandonment of national sovereignty that it facilitates. This phenomenon will penetrate Australia during the new government's term in office. And so, for posterity, I've made 5 predictions for the next 3 years under the socialist faction of Australia's Uni Party. First, let us be clear though. This metamorphosis was already well advanced in Australia before the 2022 election. It began, as it did everywhere it has taken root, years or even decades ago, but it metastasised in 2020 with the arrival of the COVID pandemic and the sudden and unprecedented imposition of unilateral tyranny on a hitherto free and innocent people. Sadly, in the last 2 years, Australia lost its innocence. It allowed itself to be divided by the very worst actors in our great human play, and it turned in on itself and created a tiered system of personhood. Throughout this shameful episode, the so-called conservative, so-called Christian Prime Minister did nothing. He sat idly by while the state governments abused their people in horrific, inhuman ways. Scott Morrison did not adopt the globalist mantle of lockdowns with the same zeal as his Canadian or New Zealand counterparts. Nor was he as hands-on as his conservative colleague in the UK, Boris Johnson. But he was entirely absent from the conversation in Australia, keeping his mouth shut and effectively endorsing the gross abuses of the state premiers through his establishment of the ludicrous National Cabinet. This charlatan of a man, this servile functionary, facilitated Australia's fall through his complete lack of action on behalf of the people he was elected to represent, the Conservatives of Australia, many of whom opposed the lockdowns, masks and vaccine mandates, whose poignant placards punctuated the protest marches of last summer with cries of "ScoMo, where the bloody hell are you?" Scott Morrison betrayed Australia, and his electoral defeat is the very least he deserves for what is at best a gross dereliction of duty, and at worst, treason. Morrison was deservedly unseated, and yet Australians do not understand that what awaits them will be no better. It will in fact be worse. Unlike Trudeau and Ardern, Anthony Albanese won't go screaming off the cliff of neo-Marxism in a scarlet blaze of glory. But he will advance the agenda. Morrison was relatively strong on some crucial aspects of national sovereignty, such as immigration and the encroachment of China. But his failure to stand up to the internationalist agenda during the COVID episode made him just as culpable as any other in selling out Australia. Albanese will be equally weak when the next strain of supranational authoritarianism is rolled out, be it another pandemic, climate change lockdowns, or something else. But he will also accelerate those areas of progressivism that Morrison kept at bay. So here are my 5 predictions for Australia over the next 3 years under the Albanese government. Number 1. Escalation of the First Nations grievance industry. Colonial guilt has long been the linchpin of neo-Marxist propaganda in the decades-long project of destabilisation and demoralisation in the West. It has been used as a cudgel in all ex-colonial nations, most notably the USA, UK, Canada, France, New Zealand and Australia. The argument is a simple and compelling one at face value. These lands were stolen, therefore this country is illegitimate. There are few arguments more persuasive to the young and idealistic than this ignominious tale of theft, rape and barbarism, and it has achieved such traction in New Zealand under the Ardern regime that there is currently policy in the works to institute a new political system of co-governance with local iwi, Maori tribes. If passed, this would render New Zealand's democracy defunct, with the establishment of a new legislative stratum based not on popular vote, but ancestral blood. Australia has to date been far more reticent in allowing its own colonial grievance industry to gain such momentum. This will likely change under the Albanese government, and within the next 3 years, the co-governance conversation will have found voice. Number 2. LGBTQIA+ everything. Another cornerstone of woke globalism is the ever-expanding acronym of the so-called lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual plus community, and its associated flag. This vast umbrella of counter-normative lifestyles and identities is a powerful weapon in the destabilisation of nations and communities, mainly through its promotion of ideas and activities that undermine the traditional family, and thus childbearing. Children that do spring from within, or who are drawn into this so-called community, will inevitably vest their trust and allegiance in the state and corporate-sponsored messaging that affirms rainbow pride, rather than the traditional family and community-orientated values of the church and the nation-state. This ideology is already firmly entrenched at the state level in Australia, especially in Labour-controlled jurisdictions, but under Albanese, the federal government will dramatically ramp it up also, much like the Biden regime has done in the US. Number 3. Cozying up to China. The influence of the Chinese Communist Party within Australia is already alarming, as Senate candidate and anti-genocide activist Drew Pavlou has been striving to bring to people's attention, but most notably when he was recently arrested and fined $1,000 for holding a blank sign outside the Chinese consulate in Brisbane for the crime of causing anxiety to the public. Despite tough talk on China and various diplomatic spats during the Morrison government's tenure, Chinese money and influence continues to find its way into Australian institutions. Evidently, as can be surmised from Pavlou's treatment, to the extent that Australian law enforcement officers now function as de facto political police for the CCP. Chinese influence is a core component of the globalist agenda, as it subverts national identity and Western values in favour of a utilitarian, authoritarian worldview that is aligned with the goals of the WEF. Under the Albanese government, Australia will soften its stance on China, and this infiltration will accelerate. Number 4. Embracing the WHO. Like Ardern's Labour government in New Zealand, the Democrats under Biden, and Trudeau's socialist regime, the new Australian government under Anthony Albanese will align itself more closely with the World Health Organization and UN. This will likely mean ratifying the WHO's new pandemic treaty and other supranational accords and compacts that will cede ever-increasing amounts of national sovereignty to the vast, unelected bureaucracies of the UN and its many offshoots. This rapidly accelerating slide towards world government was halted in its tracks by the ascendance both of Donald Trump and the Brexit victory in 2016. But since the arrival of the pandemic and the so-called defeat of Trump in 2020, the project has resumed at a fevered pace. One gets the impression that it is being fast-tracked now, before any more pesky populists can derail things again. The Albanese government will help facilitate this down under. Number 5. Domestic surveillance and censorship. Naturally, with an increased focus on racial and sexual identity, there will also come a growing level of hysteria about racism, bigotry, and hate. We know this because it is exactly what has happened in the US, UK, and New Zealand, to name but 3 of the most prominent examples. To combat this rising torrent of extremism, the Albanese government will need to get tough, and that will mean trampling on a few civil liberties. Such efforts will likely run into issues, as we've seen with the recent shelving of Biden's Ministry of Truth, after public condemnation of the planned Disinformation Governance Board forced the regime to pull back and regroup. This won't stop them trying though, so look out for similar Orwellian noises coming out of Australia in the near future. It's not too late for Australia to pull out of its nosedive, but the remedy does not lie within the falsehood of the two-party system, much less with a Labour government. Each of the 5 policy directions I've discussed will work both independently and synergistically with one another to further the demoralisation and destabilisation of Australia, as described by KGB defector Yuri Bezmenov in his 1984 interview, linked in the description. They will be presented to a credulous Australian public using the language of kindness, inclusivity, and safety, and they will be broadly accepted as the right thing to do by many, and simply inevitable by others. A committed minority will continue to raise the alarm through discourses such as what you've just heard, but they will be shouted down as conspiracy theorists and extremists. And it will not be until the fall of Australia is complete and irreversible that this once proud and rugged people will realise the monstrous disgrace they have abetted through political naivety and blind faith. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to my Substack at jjdawson.substack.com. And if you'd like to keep in touch, please do follow me on Twitter at RealJJDawson. You can also follow me on Getter, Gab and Minds. And of course, if you enjoyed this, please do give it a like and share it about, because it really helps me out.